Well, good morning, everybody. I must say I've enjoyed the commentary so far. So I'm going to give you the view from down under, and here we go. So again, a bit like Ken's comments, I've tried to drift into what some of our current colleges' approaches to the challenges are, and that'll be embedded in the talk. Now, we just seem to have lost the talk. I'm not quite sure what happened then. Thank you. Here's the slide that I submitted, and again, I thank the organising team for the opportunity to discuss all of this beforehand. I thought the idea of 3 key points and then 3 or 4 smaller points was a good way of focusing it. So we're going to speak about these half dozen points, and again, that's the summary slide that's been provided. Let's go into the detail a little bit. In Australia and New Zealand, people enter surgical training typically in PGY year 4, 5 or 6. That's not necessarily something that our college has designed, but that's the practical way that it works. And again, our program's referred to as set surgical education and training. The college recognises that a lot of time is spent in those first few years, which is not necessarily particularly focused on a pathway, and again, it's a long way removed from Professor Resnick's perspective that was illustrated this morning. The college's response to that is to design what we're calling a junior doctor program, which enables these young doctors to have access to the college resources. We're going to provide a series of extra courses. Note what's available outside with the other medical colleges, and again there's a lot of collaboration going on in Australia with the other medical colleges, particularly the procedural colleges such as obstetrics and gynaecology, anaesthesia, emergency medicine. We're also directly speaking with the medical schools, and again, depending on which state of Australia one's involved with, the hospital network system is important in some states and less important in others. Remembering in Australia that, again, for context, the college has control and sets the standards for surgical training in education as well as professional development when one becomes a fellow. At the same time, we're not the employers, and the employers are strongly based in the hospitals where the trainees work as employees. We have a logbook system which is being further developed so that we can potentially log the procedures that junior doctors get involved with. The concept of entrustable professional activities has only been widely used in Australia by the Psychiatry College, but we think that's got a lot of merit for identifying what junior doctors should be able to do, and that of course represents improving work-based assessment. An e-portfolio system is in design at the moment and again requires a certain amount of collaboration, but we hope to take that as far as identifying reflections of the junior doctors and again potentially the trainees of the future, as well as personal learning programs. And again, the involvement is not just about our own college. We may be in a sense leading this activity, but we certainly need to have the other key colleges on board. The second issue, which again has already been touched on by some of the previous speakers, is what about non-service education time? Now clearly that can be about clinical progress, it can be about providing regular feedback and assessment as Professor Resnick has identified, but we think many of the other activities tend to get lost in our busy service time, which again, hospital practice in Australia is split between private and public practice. Journal time, the concept of remedial work, the possibility of faster progress with recognition of prior learning, and again reference to some of Richard's comments this morning. Simulation activities are variably organised in Australia and New Zealand, sometimes done very well and tied to day-to-day practice, but otherwise are seen as a separate issue. The quality and safety agenda, we know my predecessor did a lot of work with WHO on the quality and safety agenda, particularly the checklist, but again we know in day-to-day work in Australasia that's not necessarily well used. And the bigger issues of professionalism and tying that into clinical activities. Faculty development, again, Ken's just referred to that, particularly as did Carlos, but again, more and better surgeon educators who are well engaged are as important. And since I started in 2012, we've got our Academy of Surgical Educators up and running as a very viable institution within the college. I'm going to speak about that tomorrow, and I'm certainly happy to chat to people about that during the next few days. In some ways it's similar to the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh approach, and Craig and I have had some very interesting conversations about that, and we hope to link those two organisations more formally in the future. As one of the products leading to better faculty development, we're establishing what we're referring to as a foundation skills course for surgical educators, and again we think that'll give senior trainees, junior consultants and people in the workplace a good one-day top up or start off in surgical education to fit with all the other courses that are provided. Leadership and management, again, I've had some interesting conversations with some members of the English College about leadership and management. How do we get that really going with surgeons and trainees in the workplace? Again, I point to the fact that particularly in Australia we have a visiting medical officer model of practice where people tend to work part-time in the public hospital system, and the rest of the time they work privately. As a result, many of my colleagues are disengaged with what happens in the public hospital and sometimes struggle. And I know from my own practice with 3 other people, we're all quite different in how we look at the way we should practice medicine, how much one should put into the system, etc. Again, we think it's important about encouraging other aspects of practice, not just about the clinical, technical, non-technical aspects of day-to-day work. Actually, conversations with some of the junior doctors who are going to get involved with our program suggests to me that the generation coming through will actually get this point a lot better than people of my vintage. Therefore, however, we must notice that as these young people come through, there'll be a long time before they influence the system. In Queensland, one of the Australian states, there's a very well-developed clinician leadership program which often involves 200 or 300 leading consultants, including a substantial number of surgeons each year. And again, a bit like Canada with our distributed population, mainly based in big cities, certainly surgeons often have very important leadership roles in the communities in smaller towns, and I need to acknowledge that. Professionalism, again, is a very big issue in our college at the moment. We try and reject that phrase soft competency. I think that tends to denigrate the whole area. And our CEO has recently written a substantial thesis paper about professionalism, or the lack of it, in surgeons in Australia and New Zealand. And I acknowledge Dr. Hillis's work there, but David distilled it down to 3 key words in his abstract. One was about reflection, just about thinking about what one does, thinking about the power of role modelling in one's work. Relationality, how we relate to all of the people we need to work with in the health workforce team, and the resilience about the human factors of being a surgeon. It's not always easy, as I'm sure most people in this room would acknowledge. The post-fellowship years, or the question of people coming through the training program as competent but not particularly confident surgeons, again surfaces consistently in our college as a problem. Mentorship may be part of the answer, but again surveys of junior consultants and trainees suggest that only about 1/4 to 1/3 are interested in what could be called a mentorship program. I think we need to look to the practical aspects of what happens in those first couple of years post leaving the training program. I think it's extremely helpful for young surgeons coming through to be involved in a unit that involves several other surgeons. That might be a hospital-based department, it might be a private practice. And certainly I'm sure we'd all recognise that asking for help in those few years is perfectly fine. And as part of that, again, trying to look at some of the solutions, we're currently evaluating our training program in terms of aspects relating to selection, better in training work-based assessment, and really how does the fellowship exam relate to all of those. And thank you very much for the opportunity of contributing.